This is not an attack on disinformation. This is an attack on dissent. It's not an attack on hate speech. It's an attack on free speech. That's really what this is. And this is the kind of Orwellian, what I call in the report, NEU speak, based on Orwell's Newspeak. But this is the EU's Newspeak, where the world is turned upside down, and they get to say what's legitimate and what's illegitimate, and everything is the opposite of what it says.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. Welcome. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com in a conversation that is being recorded on the 17th of June, 2025. And today we are talking to Dr. Norman Lewis. Dr. Norman Lewis is a writer, speaker, and consultant on innovation and technology. He's also a visiting research fellow for MCC Brussels. And it is that organization which has just published an important new document/study that I want to bring to your attention today. It is called Manufacturing Misinformation, the EU-funded propaganda war against free speech, and it details how the European Commission is attempting to regulate the boundaries of legitimate public debate in Europe through a covert campaign of linguistic control and censorship, which sounds about right, unfortunately, but let's get into the nitty-gritty details. And here to join us to talk about this report is the report's author, Dr. Norman Lewis. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let's get into the bones and details of this report. But before we do so, perhaps since this is your first time on the Corbett Report, you could introduce yourself to the audience and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, my background is both political and technology. I've been in technology for many, many years. I'm now retired from business as such, but still continue to be a researcher and writer and commentator. My background was in international politics. That's what my PhD is in. I was in Orange, which is France Telecom. I was Director of Technology Research there for about 10 years. My last real stint in business was with PwC in the UK, where I ran a crowdsourced innovation service, which was very unique. Anyway, that's my background. And I've really been fascinated by the relationship between technology and society. In other words, how technologies enter society, how they change society, that kind of what you might call the dialectical relationship between the two. And I've been obsessed with that for many years, and innovation obviously is a part of that. Just in the last few years, I've become involved with the MCC Brussels as a think tank, focusing on the EU and what's happening in the EU. I published a report 18 months ago on the EU's digital sovereignty strategy and the problem that they've got, which is essentially that in Europe we don't have technology, but we have regulation of technology.
Yes, right. Well, it sounds like you and I share a lot of the same interests, including that intersection of technology and society. I am a product of that intersection of technology and society. Me, a lowly English teacher in Japan who became a podcaster who's talking to hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Of course, enabled by the types of incredible technological innovation that we've seen over the past few decades, which, of course, is anathema to controlled, centralized power structures that know that their bread is buttered on controlling discourse rather than allowing free discourse between free people. So, on that note, this is obviously something that I've been looking at and studying and that affects me personally. So I'm very interested in this report, which opens by noting that a specter is haunting Europe, but not the specter of disinformation or hate speech. No, it is the specter of linguistic control and censorship to curb free speech. And it's not coming from China or Russia, but the heart of the EU itself, from the European Commission. Specifically, this report details the hundreds of unaccountable and non-governmental organizations and universities that the European Commission is funding to carry out 349 projects related to countering hate speech and disinformation to the tune of almost 650 million euros. So they're spending upwards of €500 million simply on this bugbear of hate speech and disinformation. It's a fascinating report. Tell us about this network that has been formed and is being funded by the European Commission.
Well, after your summary, I mean, I don't think I need to say much. It was an excellent summary. Thank you very much for that. Well, I think that what people need to understand is the following: that you have a situation in which the EU Commission commissions projects, research projects, from NGOs, universities, etc., that are not what we would call in real research projects that are looking for truth. They're projects that are aimed to prove the assumption, which is that hate speech exists, it's a big threat to the future of democracy, that disinformation is a major threat. It's like the spectre of communism was during the Cold War. And what they do is they get organizations to put in proposals on research different aspects of all of this. So a lot of these reports that we uncovered, for example, deal with the application of artificial intelligence. And that's something we can talk about in a little more detail, because I think that's a very ominous misuse of AI. We'll come back to that. But so what they do is they get these people to do these so-called projects, funding them to, as you say, over €500 million, which, by the way, is about 30% more than they spend on cancer research in Europe, that the Commission spends on cancer research. It kind of says to you one thing very importantly, which is that obviously the Commission feel the cancer of free speech is a bigger problem, a threat to them, than the real cancer disease that claims up to 2 million lives a year in Europe. And that's quite an important point, because it just shows you the kind of order of priority, why they are so concerned about getting these institutions to put out these reports that basically frame the debate. They frame the concept of hate speech, they frame the debate about disinformation, and they prove, and I say in inverted commas prove, because it's not like they're starting out with the research to question the assumptions or to even question the project's objectives. It's there basically to give answers to already assumed questions. And so it's not research, it's basically the production of propaganda, but paraded as academic, independent academic, which legitimizes the whole thing. And so the problem then is all these reports end. It's quite remarkable when you read them, and I read a lot. I mean, I'll come back to the 349 projects, which, by the way, is just the tip of the iceberg, and I'll explain why that's the case. But when you read them, they all end, unsurprisingly, by saying more research is needed, because hate speech is so difficult to determine. We need, and disinformation is so disguised and blah, blah, blah. And what they don't really acknowledge is one of the reasons why hate speech is so difficult to discern is because it's an entirely subjective category. Who determines what hate speech is? And so something that is a normal consequence of a concept that is so nebulous, they turn into a proof that more research is needed. And so the more research is needed, so they have more projects. You get more people involved, and NGOs and organizations, and they start doing all this work. And so it's like a recursive feedback loop that simply reinforces what they're trying to get people to accept, which is that this is a big problem. And so, they artificially are creating this propaganda as a way of a permanent source of legitimizing what they are doing, and particularly legitimizing legislation like the Digital Services Act, which, as you know, is the means through which the Commission controls what can be said online through big tech, through the social media platforms. So it's a very disingenuous, dishonest discourse that just reinforces something that legitimizes what they are trying to set out to do.
Exactly. As you discuss it in detail in this report, in a sense, it's a category error, or maybe that's not even the correct way of saying it, but they have invented a category of speech that is essentially any political discourse that they don't like, is misinformation or disinformation or hate speech or illegal speech. They have all these vague terms that are never defined, and these reports that are claiming to research these phenomena are really just, as you say, starting from a conclusion and then saying, "Hey, look, we found this conclusion," which doesn't seem to really legitimate the concept
Yeah,
of
yeah,
research itself.
yeah. Well, the concepts they use are very important. So they always go on about ecosystems of disinformation. Essentially, what that is any political party, particularly the populist, the far right. The far right. This is the big bogeyman. Anything that doesn't accept, uncritically accepts the kind of federalist, cosmopolitan view of the EU elite is an ecosystem of hate or an ecosystem of disinformation. And so just simply it's the views and ideas that they don't like that they categorize in this way as a means of delegitimizing it. And that's the really important point here, that it's delegitimizing what is effectively an appropriate and a legitimate democratic contestation of ideas, which is what you would expect a free society to be based upon. And that's why my report, which is not just exposing the fact that hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money is being used in this way, is a real a democratic call out, because this is a real threat to democracy. If you control language, you control the conversation, you control the past, you control the present, and more importantly, you control the limits of the political imagination as to what dissent represents. So, the thing about disinformation is that this is not an attack on disinformation. This is an attack on dissent. It's not an attack on hate speech. It's an attack on free speech. That's really what this is. And this is the kind of Orwellian, what I call in the report, NEU speak, based on Orwell's Newspeak. But this is the EU's Newspeak, where the world is turned upside down, and they get to say what's legitimate and what's illegitimate, and everything is the opposite of what it says. I could go on about.
Well,
that
let's drill down on some specific examples of that, because you have so many really fascinating and illustrative, really, really interesting examples of how this language is distorted in order to create the narratives that they want to instill. For example, when surveillance is defined as safety, or censorship as content moderation, or, for example, the word service is part of a conscious misdirection, as you note here. You say it enables the EU Commission to describe the policing of speech and unofficial political narratives as ensuring the fine-tuning of a technical delivery system. Policy replaces politics, while resistance is isolated as a breach of contract. Very interesting and very, very apropos. I don't think people really understand the power of language to completely control political debate and discourse in the EU.
Well, James, it's very, very good that you pick up on that point, because I think this is such an underestimated area of discussion, just how important this language is. And as you say, you think about the concept of the Digital Services Act. It just sounds to me, it sounds like, this is like, it's like the moderation of a utility. It's like the social media companies who serve up gas and electricity or water. So that speech is now a commodity that should be controlled by some kind of contractual obligation. It's not an inalienable right. It's not a democratic right anymore. It's a commodity that gets serviced. And anything that threatens that, it's like it's like the contract that you have with your telephone company. How many minutes can you get a month, data or voice or whatever, and so no one stops and says, "Oh, hang on a minute, this is actually about speech. This is actually So what the S in DSA actually should say is the Digital Speech Act, or the Digital Surveillance Act. No, services. This Orwellian, this term that sounds so neutral and benign, and in fact it's nothing more than as you just said, it's a cover for censorship. That's really what it is. They dictate what can be said, who can say it, who's legitimate, who's illegitimate. That's what it's all about.
On a similar note, I can't let it go without comment, is the absolutely ridiculous acronyms that are employed by all of these various organizations and their reports and what have you, that go from the relatively benign, like nodes or prompt, to vigilant vital intelligence to investigate illegal disinformation. Just such ridiculous manipulation of language to try to twist it into these handy acronyms. My favorite, or least favorite, I guess depending how you look at it, being FAST Lisa, Fighting Hate Speech Through a Legal ICT and Sociolinguistic Approach. Perhaps this is the most profound part of the report, but it's one that I couldn't escape noticing, is their reliance on these types of acronyms to create again a way of approaching this that sounds almost like as you say, like they're marketing a tube of toothpaste or something, as opposed to surveillance and tyranny.
Yeah. Well, where you're wrong, and in fact I think the report's wrong, where I think we should have changed the language. It's not an acronym, because an acronym is the capitalization of the first letter of words in a phrase. This isn't. They'll capitalize anything as long as it gives them this nice benign language style, like fast Lisa. It sounds like I like a digital assistant or someone who's going to remind you to take your medicine. So it's very sugar coated, and it disguises the intention. Now, that project, which is really worth looking at, is nothing more than a project to reprogram and educate young people to become agents of against hate speech. In other words, it's a kind of outsourcing of censorship to a younger generation to teach them about hate speech and for them to spot hate speech, not giving them the critical ability to deal with harmful content or to in a democratic way deal with I'm not denying that speech can be hateful or that hate speech doesn't exist. Of course we know it does exist, but it's not about giving people the ability to deal with it. It's more the ability to think and act in terms of what the Commission says is hate speech, and they're training these agents. So Fast Lisa is basically, it's like a re-education program, all along the lines of the North Korean education system. I mean, it is really quite remarkable, and this is all done, of course, always in the name of democracy and etc. This is a really important point, and what it said to me was that, you just think about it, that it's like they're sugarcoating. It's almost like they're saying they're trying to reassure the public. So they're treating the public like children. It infantilizes everybody. That we can't face the truth about hate speech. We have to sugarcoat this because we are so. And this is really, for me, probably the most important point throughout the report, is the assumption that they have that ordinary people in Europe are just thick, gullible. Do not have the moral agency or the moral independence to make decisions for themselves, that they to be able to distinguish between truth and lies, etc. So they, on behalf of us, the enlightened ones, the elite, the technocrats, the experts, that they should decide for us. So they do these acronyms and everything as a kind of sugarcoating to kind of make us feel good, so we can sleep well at night. Like little children, we can get tucked up in bed and have a bedtime story read to us. They treat us like idiots, and but that's really important because that's what they believe. All this stuff that I'm cataloguing in this report really takes off after 2016. Now, 2016 was Brexit and the first election of Donald Trump. And their entire explanation for Brexit was that people were lied to. The British people were lied to, and that's why they voted for Brexit. The idea that there could be something intrinsically wrong, anti-democratic in the way that the EU operates, or that people have a legitimate concern about control over borders or energy or the Green Deal, all these things which are legitimate concerns that people would have. Just look what happened with the farmers in Europe last year around the energy and the Green Deal. The idea that this is legitimate, of course it's not us, it's them. The problem is you, stupid, you listen to lies, you didn't listen to us, and we know what's best for you, etc.
It's so important that you place that in that history. It's so important that you place that in that history, because when you frame it in that way and you put it in the context of, for example, this is a response to the Brexit vote, then we understand that the EU is, of course, just acting in its own interest to protect its own interest. It's the EU essentially trying to criminalize or outlaw dissent against the EU, which makes perfect sense from that institutional perspective.
Yeah,
I
that's
understand why
exactly
they would
right.
do that. But that, of course, in the minds of the public, if they understood that context, then that completely delegitimizes all of these fancy programs and all of the things that they're doing and misinformation and hate speech. No, they're trying to outlaw opposition to themselves. Of
Yeah,
course they are. But that's exactly why people should be opposed to this.
yeah.
It's
Well, the point of the fact is that just look what's happening in Europe. Look at the growth of the populist parties now, and all the elections are, it's not going away. If anything, it's going to increase. So, in a lot of respects, you can understand both why they're doing it, and more importantly, why they're going to become more desperate to do it, because they are losing the argument. People are not listening to this, and they're not buying it anymore. And they don't listen to the legacy media anymore. They've become immune to this. I'm going to vote against the Green Deal. I'm a fascist. This kind of this legitimization of an entirely legitimate political standpoint. That's what's happening. And so I think what we're going to see, and it's a very interesting thing, if you look at what's next in line, and by the way, I'm just starting to do a report on this, is what von der Leyen has just announced a few months ago, the Democracy Shield. It's basically going to be an anti-democratic bunker that they're building for themselves, and again, this is going to be another way that they're going to control the discourse and everything, and we're going to expose that as well. That we're just starting to work on that now. Can I just get back to that point about the projects, because it's very important for people to understand that this is the tip of the iceberg, because the information that we discovered is actually in public. It's very difficult to get hold of because it's in these databases. There's no consistency in the way that the figures are recorded. It's very easy to double account because you're not sure you're talking about the same project. Sometimes you're not sure exactly what money has been allocated versus money that has been spent. It's really, it disguises the whole thing. But if you go and search on these databases, for example, which I did a search on mental health. I discovered something like 240 projects. Again, millions of euros. When I went into it, some of them were genuinely mental health projects. They were clinical, whatever. Many were exactly the same as we're talking about. We're talking about, the mental health of social media for young people. And then you realize that you read that, and suddenly, what we're concerned about is that people are able to understand European values, and you think, what has this got to do with mental health? Of course, it's got nothing to do with mental health. It's another propaganda tool. And let's just be clear, these are not reports that are written by 3 or 4 people and then they just get put on a shelf. More often than not, they are projects that involve hundreds of people, particularly young people, in groups, and these organizations now are funded to the point that they wouldn't exist if it were not for this kind of funding. So you're actually creating institutions that have a material interest in maintaining this. And that's what becomes so disingenuous, because it just corrupts everything. It corrupts civil society, because there's no debate, because if you're only funding one side of the argument, that's not a debate, that's propaganda. And more than that, if you're corrupting research from academic institutions, where research is not about discerning the truth or uncovering something new, it's about proving the assumption. It's results. It's not evidence-based policy. It's policy-based evidence. That's what's happening. The whole thing's flipped on its head. You're corrupting academia itself, and that's, by the way, is another area of research that we're doing at MCC, and we're going to be bringing out a report on that quite soon, which is really, really worrying in terms of what this means for the future.
Earlier, you alluded to the AI implementations that are being used increasingly in these projects, and you write about some of them in the report, for example, Vera.ai and Titan. Can you tell us about how AI is going to be used as part of this dragnet of surveillance?
Yeah. This is very, very important part of this, and we're just beginning to uncover what's really going on. It's very interesting. In the EU, as you well know, they passed a piece of legislation last year called the Artificial Intelligence Act, and this was heralded as the world's first regulation of AI. And everyone, they were patting themselves on the back. This is the EU's GDPR, another piece of legislation that's going to, they are going to control how AI is going to develop around the world. Well, I can tell you what that report was about ring fencing. It was about safety. It's about the precautionary principle that, AI systems, if they're going to cause harm, how do you define harm? If it's directly people who are using it directly. But everything was like, tightly controlled. You can't do this, you can't do that, So, but, aside from the fact that what they're doing is they're regulating the foundational models, not the applications, the models. So, it's like they're regulating the invention, the process of invention, rather than the application of this in the future. But when it comes to speech, however, all that precaution goes out the window. Then they're quite happy and they're demanding that Facebook and X and whatever use AI algorithms to spot, to detect hate speech or disinformation and automate the process of taking this stuff down. And so what we've already got in practice, it's not something for the future. What's happening now is that AI is being used to control speech by this use of artificial intelligence based upon a database of hate categories, who decided whether there's no debate about whether they're not, or it does not, we're talking about large language models that don't understand context. They have no comprehension of language. They're just simply predictive algorithms and words based on databases. No understanding, but they are quite happy for this to be used. And I would urge any of your listeners, just go and check out the database, the transparency database for the DSA, the Digital Services Act. You will discover, if you go to that's publicly open. What's not publicly open is that they don't disclose the content. But if you search for hate speech on that, you will see that there are hundreds and thousands of pieces of content being taken down on a weekly basis. But we don't know what the content is. We just know that they've called it hate speech. And so this is happening now. So they're already controlling this. But it's not just controlling words or whatever. They can also, through those algorithms, basically stop the spread. They will ensure that, they basically, will not allow it to trend. They will not allow it to be passed on. Basically, they'll hide it. So the algorithms will dictate as to whether that's going to be exposed or not. And so what you obviously suspect, right, is that this is not just it could be legitimate hate speech, it could be terrible sexual stuff, it could be racist, whatever. But more often than not, I can assure you, it's probably to do with migration. It's probably to do with people questioning the whole gender identity, the transgender ideology, all of that stuff. And this is now ruled out, basically. This is hate speech, and it gets just automatically taken down. And unless you're a real zealot who's going to pursue this and say, why was this post taken down, etc., etc., I mean, who's got the time or the energy to do that? Basically, it means that people are being deprived in the public square of the 21st century of an open discussion about legitimate issues. These are real issues. They're not.
Well, again, I can speak to that from my experience as someone who had a YouTube channel of over 500,000 subscribers deleted, algorithmically censored for daring to question health authorities and their pronouncements a few years ago, and then algorithmically had my channel just delivered back to me a month ago because YouTube now apologizes. Oops, sorry, yeah, it turns out you didn't break the community guidelines. Whatever. Here you go. Here's your channel back. Continue on. It's absolute nonsense and hogwash. So I know that from the inside out. But I also know what you're speaking to, the way that they can limit and censor and curtail the spread of information, not misinformation, the spread of information as they so deem fit at any time. Because I, for example, have hundreds of thousands of people who thought, I guess I just dropped off the face of the planet because my YouTube channel was no longer there. It's it's very, very disheartening to think about. But on that note, I don't want to leave this Yes, please.
I just wanted to circle back to the DSA again, just to make the point that services stuff again. What that suggests to people is that you've got a choice. Either we as the Commission decide, or big tech should decide. What's not contested is that anybody should decide. That the real way to counter hate speech is more speech, not censorship. No, that's not the choice they're given to people. The choice is, do you want an unaccountable big tech company who we didn't vote for, whose allegiance is to their shareholders, not to us? Or do you want the Commission, again, an unaccountable body that we haven't voted for? So basically you're given a choice. Which unaccountable body do you want to have control over speech? We're not, George Orwell couldn't have made that up. I mean, that's the fantastic thing about this. And it's all done in the name of European values and democracy.
Do you want the feces sandwich or the vomit sandwich? You must choose one. Yes, all right. So in conclusion, then, let's not leave this on a defeatist attitude. You wrote this report, obviously, in the attempt to raise awareness of these issues, make more people aware of the many, many projects that are ongoing, more than you were even able to document here. As you say, you've only skimmed the surface of it. But what then do you want going forward from this? Once we raise awareness, what can people start doing about this problem?
Well, I think we can contest it. I think the more people question this, the more people that demand that there should be speech, that we should be vigilant about any attempts to kind of close down debate. I think, for example, in November this year, under the DSA, there will be a review. Now, my choice in all of this would be, let's scrap the DSA. That should be the campaign, and we should, if we could, we should launch this in all the member states. Just say, apart from that, if we've got political parties in the member states, they, for example, could pass legislation that says we're not going to implement the DSA, which would be unprecedented. But there are, I spoke in the European Parliament just last week. We had a meeting organised by the Patriots group, packed out, of MEPs, of members of the public who are really concerned about this. And one of the things that came up was that the guy from I think it was Croatia, that that they are preparing legislation that's going to say, well, we will not implement the DSA because we think it's a censorship thing. Now that's that would be fantastic. So I think that the real point about all of this is, look, we're a think tank, right? We're not a political party, but is that at least the conservative parties across Europe, the patriot groups, even the other conservative groups who are not part of that, the patriots, they do and are recognising that there is a really big problem here, and they are making this a political issue, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to make free speech a political issue in Europe, and amongst ordinary people, which there will be a lot of support for. The majority of people don't even know what the DSA is. If you had to ask ordinary people in the streets of even Belgium, what's the DSA? They'll look at you like it's like something up there. But I think by doing this, thank you to you, people like you and others who are, publicising this and reaching audiences, we've just got to raise awareness about this because, this is such a fundamental freedom. This is, without free speech, we have no democracy, and that's really what's at stake here. Raise it. I say that what we've got to do is got to popularise going back to the Enlightenment values of someone like Spinoza, who made that wonderful statement about every man should have the right to think what he likes and say what he thinks. That's the principle.
It doesn't get more simple than that, but it's a timeless truth, and I would consider it a win if nothing else. We can just get it drilled into the minds of the public that when we hear about the threat of misinformation and hate speech, look, I have a simple, easy solution. We don't even need any legislation for it. Free speech, public debate, free and open communication between free peoples making up their own minds. Wow. Done. Problem solved. But that isn't the answer that's on the table for us, is it?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, that's what we've got to fight. That's what we've got to fight for. Yeah.
Exactly right. Well, this report goes some way towards doing that. I am definitely hoping people will follow the link. I'll, of course, put the link in the show notes for people who need it. Manufacturing Misinformation, the EU-funded propaganda war against free speech. And as you alluded to, you're working on some other reports that I think people will be able to look forward to in the near future. Are there any other websites or places you'd like to send people to?
No, I'd say follow what we're doing at MCC Brussels, because we are, our objective is to shake up the bubble, and we're certainly doing that, and to get people to subscribe to our newsletters and just follow us on social media, because we put out a lot of stuff and some really, really excellent reports that counter the entire propaganda machine from Brussels.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to reading more of those reports in the future, but we'll leave it there for today. Dr. Lewis, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, James. Bye.
The Deep State. False Flags. 9/11 Truth. The Federal Reserve. Secret Wars and Hidden Histories. Fake News. Medical Martial Law. Ceaseless Propaganda. James Corbett. Reportage. Essays on the New World Order. Available where books are sold. Until they're not.
Reportagebook.com